How's it going? Today we're going to talk about section 8.3, factoring things in the form of x squared plus bx plus c. So an example of where the b and the c, it would look something like this: x squared plus 6x plus 5. So this is our goal. Is how do we deal with something like this? A couple sections ago, we dealt with things that look like this, right? Where we talked about multiplying binomials together. Well, basically what we talked about was being able to FOIL those together, where if I take the first numbers together, the x and the x, that gives us our x squared. The outside numbers together, the 5 and the x, well, that just makes 5x. The inside numbers together, the 2 and the x, well, that makes 2x. And then the last numbers together, 2 and the 5, makes 10. And then that would combine to become x squared plus 7x plus 10. Well, the last section we were going from multiplying two binomials together to make it look like this trinomial. Now the goal here is basically just to go the other direction. So now you're going to be given things that look like this or something that looks like this. Our job is to put it back into those two binomials. Okay? Well, it's actually a fairly simple process if you know where the parts come from. For example, the C, this 10. Well, that 10 came from the outside numbers together, right? Or the last numbers together, sorry, the 2 and the 5. So we multiplied the 2 and the 5 together to get that 10. The 7x, well, that came from the 2x and the 5x. Well, where it really came from was the 2 and the 5 added together. So what we're going to be looking for is basically a set of numbers that multiply together to get that last number and add up to get that middle number. Okay? Let's try one. And really the guess and check method is really the best way here for now. So basically we know that this last numbers we're going to have to multiply together to get 12. So basically what we want to do is we want to think of all the factors of basically different ways we can multiply together to get 12. Well, 1 times 12 is 12, 2 times 6 is 12, and 3 times 4 is 12, right? But then we also want to think of these combinations as we have to add up together to get this 7x. Well, 1 plus 12 does not get us to 7. 2 and 6 does not get us to 7. But 3 and 4 do, right? So we found that combination of two numbers that multiply together to get that 12 and add up together to get the 7, right? So what that means is this will be the same thing as x plus 3 and x plus 4. We have the 3 and the 4 is going to multiply together to get the 12, and the 3 plus the 4 is going to add up together to get the 7. Okay? And again, you should be able to check that where you FOIL that back together, and it should end up right back to where you started, right? So we go x times x, that gives me x squared. Our outside numbers together, x and the 4, give us 4x. Insides would give us 3x. And the last numbers would get us 12. And sure enough, that'll get us right back to where we wanted to be. Okay? So this is basically the process. Let's try a couple more problems here. Okay? So again, what we're looking for is two numbers that multiply together to get 8 and add up to 6. Well, the ways you can get to 8, 1 times 8, 2 times 4, right? And it really doesn't matter if you list them 1 and 8 and 2 and 4, 4 and 2 backwards. It really doesn't matter. And then we think of these as which of these combinations are both going to also add up to that 6. Well, sure enough, the 2 and the 4 add up to the 6. So we multiply together to get 8. We add up to get the 6. We found our combination. That means the answer is x plus 2 and x plus 4. And again, if you wrote x plus 4 and x plus 2, it does not matter. Either of those answers would be sufficient. Okay? How about this? What two numbers multiply together to get 6? Well, 1 times 6, 2 and 3. Well, which of those combinations also adds up to get 5? Well, 2 plus 3 is 5. So that tells me the answer is I'd have x and x, plus and plus, and be a 2 and a 3. Simple enough? Well, things get a little bit more complicated when we start dealing with some negatives, okay? But before I do those, I kind of want to show you, basically where do the signs come from? If you think about just the different combinations of what we could see, right? We can deal with two positives. We can deal with a negative and a positive and a negative there, negative, right? Well, if you think about what's going on here, we have to have two numbers that multiply together to get a positive and then add up to a positive. Well, how do you multiply together to get a positive? Well, a positive times a positive would equal a positive, but a negative times a negative would also equal a positive, right? So the fact that these are both positives, this one being positive, tells me that they have to be the same. So if the C is positive, that tells me these have to be the same values, right? They're either both positive or both negative. But then if they have to add up to be a positive, well, that means it has to be two positives, because that's the only way you're going to multiply together to get a positive and add up to a positive. But something like this, if this was a positive, well, that tells me these signs have to be the same, right? Because that's how you end up with a positive. And then it has to end up with a negative. Well, the only way that's going to be is if they're both negative. While we're here, the fact that this is a negative, well, how do you multiply together to get a negative? Well, basically, you have to have one of each. So I know right now, the fact that the C is negative, that tells me I'm going to have a positive and a negative. Okay? But then, how are they going to add up to be a positive, right? Well, if you have a positive and a negative, let's just take an example here like x plus 5 and an x minus 7, right? So we have one positive and one negative. If I FOIL that out, I get x squared. I end up with a negative 7x and then a positive 5x. And then again, we get our negative 35. So I've got my negative C value. And here, when I combine those, I'm going to end up with a negative 2x. So this is how I end up with a negative. And basically what happened was that negative was the bigger value, right? Because that's why it stayed negative. So basically, I can look back up here and say, if I have a negative C value, I know they have to be different, right? That tells me my signs have to be different. But the positive B value tells me that the positive number has to be the bigger value. Likewise, down here, again, if I have a negative C value, I know I have to have a positive and a negative. But since I'm a double negative, that tells me the negative has to be the bigger of the two values, okay? So let's go back to that example. We're going to go here. Well, again, positive here, I got to find two numbers that multiply together to get a positive 16. Well, the way I can get there is a 1 and a 16, a 2 and an 8, right? 4 and a 4. Well, out of those, and basically I could also go negative 1 and negative 16, negative 2 and negative 8, and negative 4 and negative 4, right? So all of those combinations works. Well, which of those are also going to add up to a negative 10? Well, 2 and 8 add up to 10, but if they add up to negative 10. So I'm going to need that negative 2 and negative 8. So here's basically the way I like to think of this. I know my signs have to be the same, right? I know it's going to be 2 and 8, right? Because two numbers that multiply to 16, they got to add up to 10. So x and x, I actually know it's 2 and 8 because they have to multiply to get, they have to be this, and I know the signs have to be the same, and they have to both be negative. Okay, so two numbers that multiply to 16 and add up to 10, right? Let's try this one. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 18. Well, 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6, right? I also know the signs have to be the same, right? And since this is negative, I know they both have to be negatives. Which of those adds up to 9? Well, 3 and 6 are the only ones that add up to 6. So again, the way I like to think about these basically is this sign right here kind of tells me if I'm going to add the two numbers together or subtract the two numbers together. Because if this is a positive, no matter what the first value is, if this is a positive, that tells me the two numbers are going to have to add up to get a 5. Kind of like this example here, when I FOILed that out, if this is negative, how do I get that 2? Well, really what I'm going to end up doing is subtracting that 5 and 2. So let's try a couple negatives here. So the way I like to think of this is this. All right, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 36. Well, 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9, 6 and 6, right? So those are all different combinations that multiply to 36. This tells me my signs have to be different. So because my signs have to be different, I'm going to end up subtracting them two numbers to get to my 9. So out of here, the only one that subtract to get 9 are that 3 and the 12. So that tells me I have my x and my x. I know I have a 3 and a 12, right? My signs have to be different, so I need one positive and one negative. It does matter which one's positive, which one's negative. I have to end up with a positive 9. So that tells me the bigger number, the 12, has to be the positive number. So that would work. And again, I should be able to easily check this. So let's try this one. Again, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 12. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Because this is negative, I'm going to end up subtracting these two numbers to get to my middle number. So my middle number is 1. Out of here, the only numbers that multiply to 12 and subtract to get 1 are the 3 and the 4. So I know it's x and 3, x and 4. My signs have to be different because of that negative, and the bigger number has to be positive. So that means the 4 has to be the positive number. Let's try a double negative here. Again, how do you multiply together to get 13? Well, the only way to get there is 1 and 13. Do those subtract to get 12? Of course. So I know it's x and 1, x and 13. Now I just got to figure out my signs. My signs have to be different because of that negative. And then the bigger number has to be negative. So the negative 1 becomes the 13. And I got a positive 1. Okay. Again, we should be able to double check and FOIL that out and make sure it works. So how about something like this? Well, how do you multiply together to get 24? 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6, right? Well, here I got a problem because a lot of people would think, well, 4 plus 6 is 10, right? But in this case, because that's negative, I'm not looking for two numbers that add up to 10. I'm looking for two numbers that subtract to 10. So 2 and 12 is actually the magic combination here. So I know it's got to be a 2 and it's got to be a 12, right? So again, my signs have to be different because of that. And then the bigger number has to be negative because of that negative 10. So the 12 is negative, the 2 will be positive, and that's how I'd have that answer. Try a few problems. Let me know how it works out. And again, send me a picture of any work you guys get done so I can keep track of that. All right. Hope everything's going well. Talk to you.